Good morning, and thank you. Well, thank you, and thank you for joining. Welcome to Mastering Azure Static Web Apps, Code, Config, Deploy. So for those of you, did any of you visit Sander's talk? Great. So Data API Builder is actually part of this, and I'm really happy that I didn't spend a lot of time building that extra demo because Sander took that for me. First, let me introduce myself real short. I'm Rick. I work for Microsoft as a senior cloud solution architect, which actually means I help customers build their best Azure environments and make the best out of their investments in Azure. You can find me online, Rick VD Bosch, almost everywhere. And if you have any questions after today, please don't hesitate to reach out. So a short agenda, because this is only half an hour session, so we need to step on the gas. We'll do a short introduction. We'll talk about how to build those static web apps. We'll look at configuring them, how settings for those applications work, and then last but not least, the resources. So at the end, you'll get this big QR code that will lead you to all of the resources used to build this demo. But first, a short introduction to the service, right? So Azure Static Web Apps has been around for a couple of years now, and initially it was introduced a couple of weeks before a build conference that Microsoft held. And the general idea was, let's find a solution of hosting a full-stack web application. In that case, it was a JavaScript full-stack web application that really streamlines the development effort and the deployment pipeline from start to finish. And as I said, initially this was primarily built for JavaScript, or only built for JavaScript, actually. Later, new platforms and other languages have been added, but that was the first edition. And then the payoff of static web apps is to develop serverless web applications fast with global reach and scale. That's a very nice marketing promise, but what does that actually mean, right? That's what we will be investigating in this session. So static web apps automatically builds and deploys a web app based on your repository or repositories. It's completely tailored to the developer's daily workflow, as I will show you in a bit. And it separates static assets from the traditional web server. And the reason this is interesting is because everything that's static doesn't need server-side compute to actually be hosted, right? So if you have static web applications that don't have that server-side compute, it can also open up the floor to optimizations, like not having to send over cookies every time you get that static file. If it's just publicly available, it should be fine. And then the next thing that it's really interesting is this is served from points geographically closest to the end user, because it's not even in Azure regions, it's in points of presence, which are even more in numbers, but also closer to our end users. So this is CDN built in, so to speak. Which also means that your file will be fastest delivered to your end user instead of having to come from a specific Azure region just because that's where your computer is. Initially, it implemented GitHub Actions, and GitHub Actions only. Later, Azure DevOps was added. Now you can also do GitLab and Bitbucket, if I'm not mistaken. But in the end, what happens is you have a code change, you put that on GitHub, and automatically the pipeline that was created for you will pick up that change and deploy it to an environment for you to review. It does have static content on one hand, which is literally JavaScript and HTML, which of course can hold dynamic content, or at least code for dynamic content, but the files itself are static. And then next to that, it automatically delivers you, if you want it, an Azure Functions backend that allow you to build APIs really, really easily. Now, like I just said, we have Data API Builder, which is a different service in Azure, but it's also supported under Static Web Apps. So if you don't even want to build your own API, you just want to configure, you can do that too. Today, we will be looking at actually implementing that backend as an API, or API as functions. If you look at those Azure functions, by default, they are included in Static Web Apps, but that also means that they only support HTTP-triggered functions, because it's web, so it's going to be an API. If you want to have more control over what happens in your backend, if you want to host it in your own Azure Functions environment, or maybe even just on a static web app, or maybe you even have an API that's built somewhere in a virtual machine, there's options for that as well, because the API connected to your static web app will by default be a managed Azure Functions environment, but you can bring your own Azure Functions. You can say, just point me at this app service, or you can even point towards API management, which opens up the floor to any and all different types of hosting of a API anywhere. There's a lot of front-end supported. I'm not going to be going into this in a lot of default. The one thing I do want to say is, mostly this is static web apps, front-ends like Angular and Next or Nuxt or React, but it also has support for Blazor WebAssembly, which means running C# in the browser of your client. And we'll have a look at that as well. And then the Azure Functions as the backend, which you don't necessarily need, but if you want them, you'll get them, are managed functions, or you can bring your own. And again, you have integrated security and seamless routing, which means if your API is connected to your static web app, the domain name of your web application /API automatically routes to the endpoint that implements your API, which means you can also have not only seamless routing because it's on the same domain, so CORS will not be an issue, but you can also say any update statement on the API or any update action should be authenticated, and the rest is anonymous access is OK. So all of that is integrated as well. Told that one already. You can bring your own. And in the interest of time, let's just quickly go into a demo. So let's see. There we go. Duplicate it real quick just to see if that happens or works. I don't have to. There we go. There we go. So making this a little bit smaller so that at least, OK. This is doable also in the back, I think, right? Yeah, I see some nodding, so that's OK. So the general idea is right here, we can see the one that's selected right here, Devworld Conference, which is a static web app. This is actually the only resource you need to run a static web app. I've added a few extras, so I've added application insights so I can automatically monitor what's happening. I've added a storage account because that's my database, and I'll show you why I did this in a second. And then there's some automated stuff that was put in there because this runs on a Microsoft tenant, and we automatically get security everywhere. But the cool thing is, if we start creating a static web app, and I'll do static web like this, and I'll really quickly put that to Azure services only. There we go. So creating a static web app is actually literally as easy as thinking of a name, which is not interesting at all because this is, you will get a randomly generated URL, so this name is not the same as the URL that you're getting. You should pick a plan, and then next to that, the only thing you need to do is connect it to a Git repo. So as you can see here, we see GitHub, Azure DevOps, and other. So I'm connected to GitHub at this point. So I could say, well, in my own personal GitHub, please tell me I clicked the right one. Oh, there we go. So in my own personal GitHub, on, let's say, this repository, I can even pick a branch. And from this point in time, if I just click Review and Create, I'm done. So I'm automatically creating a static web app as we go. And then what happens in the back end, get that second screen up there as well. What happens in the back end is, this is the GitHub repo that we were just looking at. And I'll go to Code. And I'll go Workflow and open this one up. And I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but I do want to highlight a couple of things. This is all automatically created for you. So secret management was automated for you. It put this in the GitHub repo, and then it automatically said, well, let's just get the secret from that variable on the repo. But also, the really nice thing is, in the bottom here, you can see app location, API location, and output location. That's actually something that you can configure in the Azure portal while creating your static web app. And as you can see, it automatically saw that, hey, you're doing something with Blazor. So probably I'll take that one. And then you can see it also automatically picked up the app and the API location because it says ASWA CCD web and API. Those are the folders that hold the projects that are actually my backend API and my web application. It automatically found those, and it said, well, based on that this is Blazor, sorry, I can see that we should probably go to the output location for what we want to push into that application, right? So it created all of this for me, and then it created this, this pipeline. Small note, look at the fact that there's a close pull request job right there, and I'll jump into why that is important later on. So this is the default for this static web app. So let's open up Visual Studio real quick. And I'll quickly go through what's happening here. If I get my screen to full screen, please. There we go. So who here is familiar with building Azure Functions? Okay, I feel the need to explain just a little bit. So the thing about Azure Functions is a platform in which you can automatically execute code whenever a specific trigger happens. And those triggers can be different number of things. A message on a service bus queue will allow you to trigger executing code, which means your consumer for service bus no longer needs to always be running, but it can just completely scale to 0. And then whenever a new message comes in, the Azure platform will automatically invoke the Azure function and hand the message over to the Azure function and say, please work on this for me. It could also be files being uploaded in a specific container in a storage account. It could be a number of things. And one of those things can also be an HTTP trigger, which means I can build an Azure function that completely goes to sleep if I wanted to, but then it handles my HTTP requests as soon as they come in. So those HTTP requests are triggered Azure functions are the default that are supported under Azure Static Web Apps. And then what we're seeing in this, let me take the auto hide one. And that what we're actually seeing here is this is a piece of C# code, and then this first line that's highlighted right now actually says HTTP trigger with a get and a route sessions, which actually means whenever on where this is hosted, somebody comes in and goes to /API/sessions, this code will execute. And then the even more important thing about functions is Azure Functions automatically get access to external services through bindings, which means you no longer program yourself that you will be accessing, for instance, a storage account or a SQL database, but you can configure that in your code. And that's not only available on .NET code, that's available on all languages that we support for building Azure Functions. And it automatically takes away all of the plumbing code that you need to write to access that storage account. Because as you can see right here, it says connection equals storage connection string, which means it will automatically talk to the storage account that's configured in my app settings. And in this case, I'm looking at table storage. So this takes table input. This first word right here just means it's going to look at the table sessions. And then in that table sessions, in this case, if we go sessions, it will take a enumerable of all the session entities that we have in there. And then the cool thing is that we also can go to a specific item by filtering automatically what's in the route. So if we, for instance, say sessions / and then something like ID, I can automatically start filtering on that ID right here. Going a little bit back to what we did on Azure, I can skip this one out, go to the storage account, and then under the storage account, if we go to storage browser, I will show you that there's a table that's called sessions. And this is actually a form of NoSQL storage, or yeah, a form of NoSQL storage under Azure Storage Account, which is called table storage. So anything that you add to your class that actually talks to this is automatically propagated to be a column on the data store. So this is a NoSQL solution, which means because we can talk to this very easily with bindings in an Azure function, there's like 2 lines of code and we can get all of the sessions out of a table and host it on that API relatively easily. I did say I would like to start from here, good. So there we go. There's a lot of configuration involved with Azure Static Web Apps, and a lot of it is based on convention. And the main reason for this is to open the floor to any and all language that might be supported to run a static web app. So also the .NET implementation, of course, adheres to that. Now, I already talked a little bit about authentication and the fact that we have the possibility of opening up certain parts of the application to only registered people. Well, we can do so in staticwebapp.config.json. And where normally this kind of configuration is done in the Azure portal itself, for this specific service, they have really explicitly chosen a JSON file for configuration because that fits so much better in the day-to-day workflow of full-stack developers for web applications. They don't want to go to an Azure portal and configure whatever they need to configure right there. They might even not want to open up infrastructure as code and do their configuration there. They'll just run that in their IDE, change some stuff around, and make sure that they can do. So within staticwebapp.config, one of the things that we can do is routing. So as I said, you can restrict access to users in specific roles, and you can restrict access to actions also to specific roles. It's defined in an array, so you can add as many routes as you want, and it's evaluated in the order that they are in the file. As soon as there's a match, evaluation will stop, and that match will be executed. It significantly overlaps with authentication and authorization. Again, mainly because it's really easy to configure all of that in a file. Just push the file to GitHub and see what happens. So there's a route. You can do specific things on methods. We can reroute URLs, which I will show you in a minute. We can even return specific status codes and headers. And then we have allowed roles on all of our endpoints to give access to specific roles. So wildcards are supported at the end of route paths, so that you can have, for instance, an API that is that starts with /admin. You can say, well, everything that goes to admin needs to be authenticated, and the role needs to be an admin, because otherwise, I just don't want you to be able to log in. So route and methods match routes. The rewrite, redirect, and status code and headers process after the match and after authorization. And then allowed roles is actually the authorization for the specific endpoints. We can also set global headers. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead a bit and open my Visual Studio again, because that's where the magic happens. Oh, please don't do this to me. Just there we go. I'm going to pull it off to my screen just for a second to make sure that I can get this one up again. There we go. And then under my static web app, which is web right here, which has a root, and then a staticwebapp.config.json. What you can already see right here is the first route. It says /login. Now, I have not implemented login in my front end at all. This automatically rewrites to .auth/login/AAD. And that's actually Microsoft accounts authentication, which means if you have an Outlook.com account, you can automatically log in using the AAD provider. And as you can see, everybody can go to the /login page. And then what I added is session details as a route, which needs to be authenticated if people want to go there. Then another interesting thing on line 13 is the navigation fallback, because like Angular, Blazor also manages its own routes, right? So the route is /sessions. That's not a physical file on disk. It's not a physical file that static web apps can automatically serve. It's a dynamic route to an endpoint that's being handled in index.html. So with this navigation fallback, you just say, if you can't find anything, please just try index.html first, because they might handle the routing over there. You can see a response override for /login, and then I specifically added a MIME type right there. So in my web application, the one that we're looking at right now, there's no authentication in place. So this is program.cs. There's no authentication in place. The only thing I have is something to talk to a backend API. And then if we now go to our application, which is right here, and there we go, and I refresh it just a bit, we will see that it actually pulls in all of the files that it needs to host that Blazor WebAssembly application, and I now have this application up and running. I can go to sessions, which gives me a sessions overview, and then what happens now is it's actually calling out into the API that we specified in our Azure function, and it returns all of the information that we just saw in that storage table storage account. And then we even have some details buttons right here. But the nice thing is, let's just pick this. Let's just pick this URL and open up. That's a lot of browser windows. I'll go, there we go. And let's just go, I wanted there we go, in private window. So now let's just go to the application. I can still pull in all of those sessions because this endpoint was not authenticated, right? But then, as you might have seen, /session details automatically asks for authentication. Now, if I'm logged in, that automatically works. Normally what would happen, and I'm not being able to show this right now because I can't really see on the second screen, but normally what happens, it will automatically ask you to authenticate based on that configuration that you have in static web app config.json. Now, if you want to have settings that your Azure functions need to play with, need to work with to, for instance, access databases or storage accounts or service bus or whatever, in the end, it looks really, really similar to what we do for Azure Service Bus, for Azure App Service or for Azure App Function Apps. I'll go back to this one, go to Azure Static Web App demo. I'll take the environment variables right there. And as you can see, we can put things like a storage account connection string right here. Yes, I know my keys on screen, so either memorize it or be fast because it'll be gone in like 5 minutes. But on this case, you can even specify settings for your backend that it needs to work with to access external resources. Now, there's like a ton of things that I would like to show, but there we go. In the interest of time, I'm going to make it a little bit shorter. The power of static web apps is the fact that there's a lot automatically created for you. So for instance, we have these snippets, which you can configure yourself. Think about Google Analytics that you always want to add in each and every page. What you can do here is configure that snippet here and then say, on every page under head, inject this. Or JavaScript on any page, just before the body tag, inject this. As I said, I also implemented application insights, which means I get a lot of insight in what's happening with my application by default. And then we have those APIs that we can see right here that allow us to see which API is connected to our backend. And currently, this is a managed Azure function, but this could also be, like I said, an app service, bring your own Azure function, or maybe even an API management. But what's most important to show before I leave the stage is the fact that, make it a little bit easier to read. The most important thing, I think, is the fact that I now have a pull request open. And please be advised, I did not change anything on the pipeline that was created for me. This is all out of the box once you point to that GitHub repo and say, I want to work on that main branch right there. So I now have a pull request where it says, looks so much better. The fact that there's a clown face there might scare me a little bit, but what I also see is GitHub Actions said, Azure Static Web Apps, your stage site is ready. Which means, as soon as you create an Azure Static Web App and point it to a GitHub repo, it will automatically see all of the pull requests that you create towards the branch that you're following and create an environment where it actually hosts the result of your end application after the pull request. So the guy that did this pull request maybe doesn't have the best sense of styling, so I don't think that this specifically looks a lot better than what we had. But the thing is, I can even go to the sessions page right here. So this is my secondary environment. And I can still go to the sessions page, and it will still pull in all of the information that I need, because the application is in full deployed in a stage environment, enabling me to see what's happening with that after the actual pull request has been completed. You can see those environments right there. Here, now please know that this is a free tier of the Azure Static Web App, because the pricing is very interesting. As you might see here, it has the production environment, and then in this case, a preview environment. If I'm not mistaken, you get 5 preview environments by default for the free tier, and then a whole lot more on the paid version. There's a lot more that is interesting about Azure Static Web Apps, but the cool thing is all of that has been captured under that QR code on the bottom. It links to the urls.com/ASWA or Azure Static Web Apps. There you can find the documentation, but also the repo that we just created, including the pull request. And if you have any questions, then please either shoot now or reach out to me online later. Thank you so much.